Imagine a plane so light, so fragile, that a strong gust of wind could shake it like a leaf in a storm. Now imagine that same plane diving low over columns of the most feared tanks in the world, close enough to hear the bark of machine guns turning toward it, close enough to see the gunners' faces tilting upward in disbelief. The aircraft weighs less than a family automobile. The tanks below weigh 45 tons each. By every law of war, by every calculation of physics and common sense, this should be a slaughter. And yet the man in the cockpit is not fleeing. He is attacking. This is the story of Major Charles Carpenter, a former history teacher from Illinois who mounted rocket tubes on a reconnaissance plane that had no armor, no guns, and no business being anywhere near a battlefield. The story of a man who, through sheer ingenuity, stubbornness, and a ferocity that defied his quiet academic origins, became the most improbable tank killer of the Second World War. His enemies called him a nuisance. His commanders called him unorthodox. History would call him a legend. The soldiers he saved called him something far simpler. They called him the man who came back. By September of 1944, the Allied advance across France had begun to strain against its own momentum. The summer's great breakout from Normandy, the sweeping arcs of armor and infantry that had liberated Paris and pushed through the hedgerows, had given way to the grinding reality of an enemy that refused to collapse. German forces, battered but far from broken, had begun to consolidate, to dig in, to use the terrain with the expertise of men who had been fighting since 1939. In this landscape of ruined villages, waterlogged fields and roads choked with the wreckage of two armies, the Piper L-4 Grasshopper occupied a humble but essential role. The L-4 was never meant to fight. It had been conceived as a liaison and observation aircraft, a flying set of eyes for artillery commanders who needed to know where shells were landing. It carried a pilot and sometimes an observer. It carried a radio. It carried nothing else of military consequence. Its empty weight hovered around 550 pounds. Its fabric skin, stretched over a steel tube frame, could be pierced by a strong man's fist. It flew at roughly 87 miles per hour at cruise, and its stall speed, the slowest it could fly before falling out of the sky, sat somewhere around 38 miles per hour. This last figure, that absurdly low stall speed, would become the cornerstone of a tactical revolution that no military theorist had ever anticipated. Charles Carpenter had not come to war as a warrior in the conventional sense. Before the conflict swept him from his classroom, he had been a teacher of history, a man whose professional life was spent explaining to young Americans how the great events of the past unfolded, how decisions made in moments of pressure echoed down through generations. He had studied the battles, the campaigns, the machinery of conflict in an academic context. Now he found himself living inside the very kind of story he had once taught. The irony was not lost on him. But Carpenter was not a man given to extended contemplation when action was possible. As a reconnaissance pilot, his mission was deceptively simple and genuinely dangerous. He flew low and slow over enemy positions, called in coordinates, adjusted artillery fire, and noted the movement of German columns. He did this unarmed. The L-4 carried no weapons because doctrine held that adding weight would compromise its performance, and because observation pilots were expected to avoid combat, not seek it. Carpenter followed this doctrine as long as he could stand to. The problem, as he saw it with a history teacher's clarity, was that the battlefield below him was changing in ways that made passive observation feel like abdication. German armored units were moving with increasing boldness through areas that Allied ground forces struggled to contest quickly enough. He watched tanks roll through villages. He watched columns assemble and disperse before artillery could be brought to bear. He was seeing the problem with perfect clarity, from the ideal vantage point, and he could do nothing about it. This was, for a man of Carpenter's temperament, an intolerable situation. He began to think about the bazooka. The M9A1 rocket launcher, known universally as the bazooka, was an American infantry anti-tank weapon that fired a shape-charge rocket capable of penetrating several inches of steel armor. Standard doctrine used it at close range, in the hands of infantry soldiers who crouched behind cover and hoped the tank's crew did not see them first. Against the frontal armor of a German Panther tank, the bazooka's penetrating capability was questionable at best. The Panther's sloped glacis plate was designed precisely to defeat weapons of this kind, but the Panther's top armor was a different matter entirely. The engineers who built it had concentrated their steel where they expected to be hit, from the front, from the sides, from approaching infantry. The roof of a Panther's turret and engine deck measured only between 16 and 25 millimeters in thickness. A bazooka rocket striking vertically downward would not be asking politely to enter. It would be kicking the door in. The L-4 Grasshopper, Carpenter realized, was the only platform in the Allied inventory that could consistently achieve the angle of attack that exploited this weakness. Fighter bombers flew too fast to accurately deliver unguided rockets against moving point targets on a cluttered battlefield. Artillery fired on trajectories calculated in advance, and a moving tank was a poor candidate for predicted fire. But a slow-flying observation plane, circling above a tank column at low altitude, could approach at a steep enough angle to put a rocket directly through the thin roof of an armored vehicle. The geometry was simple. The execution was something else. Carpenter approached his superiors with the idea. The response was what any soldier who has ever proposed something genuinely new to a military bureaucracy might have anticipated. The answer was no. Regulations did not permit the modification of observation aircraft for offensive use. Performance parameters would be affected. The chain of command had not authorized such a modification. The answer remained no, firmly and repeatedly, regardless of how Carpenter framed the question. He stopped asking. The details of how Carpenter acquired 6 M6A3 bazooka tubes remained somewhat improvised in the historical record, which is appropriate for a man who was himself improvising at every stage. What is certain is that he obtained them, and that he mounted 3 beneath each lower wing of his L-4 with a dedication that suggested he was not merely tinkering. He was engineering a weapon system from first principles, in a field environment, without technical support, without authorization, and without the luxury of failure. He devised an electrical firing system that would allow him to trigger the rockets from the cockpit. The system had no safety interlock. A single electrical fault at the wrong moment, a crossed wire, a loose connection jolted by turbulence, could fire a rocket into the wing above it, or ignite the fabric of the aircraft, or worse. Carpenter understood this. He flew anyway. The first test firings were, in the language of military aviation, successful. The aircraft survived. The rockets flew. The performance degradation was measurable but manageable. The improvised weapons system worked. Carpenter did not celebrate excessively. He was already thinking about the next problem. The next problem arrived on the 12th of September, 1944, in the form of a German armored column and a sky full of low cloud. Allied air power in this period of the campaign was formidable, but it was weather-dependent. The fighter bombers and medium bombers that had done so much to attrite German armor throughout the summer required visibility to operate effectively. On the 12th of September, the clouds were too low and too thick for conventional air support to engage. The German column, tanks, armored vehicles, soft-skinned transports, moved with the relative confidence of forces that believed themselves temporarily shielded from above. Ground commanders watched the situation developing and faced the prospect of engaging armor without the air support they had come to rely on. Carpenter volunteered. There is something worth pausing over in that word, volunteered. He was not ordered. He was not assigned. He raised his hand, or its military equivalent, and said that he would go. He climbed into a 500-pound fabric airplane equipped with improvised rockets that had no safety systems, and he flew toward a column of German armor and the machine guns positioned to protect it. The first rocket he fired struck an assault gun and disabled it. The column, suddenly aware that it was under attack from a source that defied easy categorization, began to respond. Ground troops swung weapons skyward. Machine gun tracers reached for the tiny, slow-moving aircraft. Carpenter came back. The consequences back at his airfield were immediate. He was grounded. The unauthorized modification of a military aircraft, the unauthorized offensive action, the sheer regulatory affront of what he had done produced the expected institutional response. Grounding was the reasonable, proportionate, and entirely predictable result. It lasted a remarkably short time. Someone with sufficient rank and sufficient tactical imagination looked at what had happened. An unarmed observation aircraft had attacked and disabled a German armored vehicle in conditions that prevented conventional air support from operating, and made a decision. The grounding was lifted. What followed in the days between his return to flight and the 20th of September was a compressed campaign of destruction that read like the fever dream of a military theorist who had abandoned caution entirely. Carpenter flew 23 combat missions in a single week. He attacked columns, isolated vehicles, dispersed formations. He fired his rockets into the thin top armor of Panthers and Panzer IVs and half-tracks. He came back, rearmed, and flew again. He was hit by small arms fire on multiple occasions. The L-4, riddled with bullet holes that would have been fatal to a human being, kept flying because fabric and aluminum tube construction, paradoxically, does not always fail catastrophically when punctured. The aircraft absorbed damage that would have downed a more sophisticated machine because there was less of it to critically damage. The men on the ground who watched him work developed a particular kind of attachment to the sound of his engine. They knew what it meant when the tiny plane circled overhead. It meant the eyes in the sky were also the fist in the sky. It meant that the German armor that had been making every advance a contest of nerves and casualties was suddenly itself exposed, itself vulnerable, itself being hunted by something it had never been designed to fear. The crisis came on the 20th of September. American forces in the sector faced a specific and terrible problem. Approximately 150 soldiers, an entire formation, men with names and families and the ordinary human desire to survive, were effectively trapped. The route required for their breakout was blocked. Blocking it were 6 Panther tanks. The Panther was not a tank to be taken lightly under any circumstances. It was, by the autumn of 1944, one of the most capable armored fighting vehicles in the world. Its front armor could deflect most Allied anti-tank rounds at battlefield ranges. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could engage and destroy Sherman tanks at distances that exceeded the Sherman's own effective range. 6 Panthers positioned to cover a breakout route represented not just a tactical obstacle but a potential catastrophe. 150 men, caught between their objective and those guns, faced the prospect of being held, hammered, and possibly destroyed. Carpenter was tasked with neutralizing the Panthers. The word task deserves examination. By this point in the campaign, his superiors had moved from toleration of his modifications to active reliance on them. The man who had been grounded for unauthorized offensive action was now being given specific combat assignments. The institutional logic had bent, as institutional logic occasionally does, to the weight of demonstrated results. Carpenter had been destroying and disabling German armor for 8 days. He had the rockets. He had the aircraft. He had, most critically, whatever it is that allows a human being to fly a fragile, unarmored plane toward a concentration of machine guns and not turn away. He took off. The approach to a Panther from the air, in an aircraft flying at under 80 miles per hour, was an exercise in controlled exposure to lethal risk. The Germans were not passive. Every ground position near the tanks had machine guns, and machine gun crews in 1944 had been fighting aircraft long enough to have developed reflexes and techniques. They knew how to lead a slow-moving target. They knew how to concentrate fire along an approach path. The L-4's low speed, which made it tactically viable as a rocket platform, also made it easy to track. Carpenter came in low, where he could achieve the steep angle of attack that would drive his rockets through the Panther's thin roof armor, and where the machine guns had the best shot at him. He fired. The first rocket struck the lead Panther. The shaped charge, detonating against 16 millimeters of roof steel, drove a focused jet of superheated metal through the armor and into the interior of the tank. Inside a Panther's fighting compartment, penetration by a shaped charge was not merely damaging, it was catastrophic. The stored ammunition, the fuel lines, the hydraulic systems, all of it became fuel for a secondary detonation that the tank's own designers had spent considerable effort trying to prevent. When a tank's ammunition cooked off, the result was often visible from considerable distance. Hatches blown upward, flame erupting from every opening, the vehicle transforming in seconds from a weapon system into a funeral pyre. Carpenter circled, came back and fired again. Machine gun fire tracked him continuously. The aircraft was hit. The fabric took bullets. Whether Carpenter felt fear during these passes, in the specific, physical, mammalian sense of the word, is a question he never fully answered in the public record. What the record shows is that he did not stop. He came back for each tank with the same methodical determination that, in another life, he might have applied to explaining a historical campaign to a classroom of teenagers who were not entirely paying attention. He was thorough. He was patient within the constraints of a battlefield. He was, above everything else, effective. One by one, across a series of attack runs that consumed time and ammunition and the tolerance of every nerve in his body, the 6 Panthers were engaged. Some detonated immediately. Some were disabled, their crews killed or driven out, their systems wrecked sufficiently to make them immovable obstacles rather than active threats. By the time Carpenter had exhausted his rockets for that engagement, the road was open. 150 American soldiers moved through a gap that had been cut not by a tank, not by a fighter bomber, not by an artillery barrage, but by a 500-pound fabric airplane flown by a man who had once taught children about battles exactly like the one he was now surviving. They moved through that gap with 0 men killed. The accounting of wounded was minimal. By any measure that the men who actually walked that road would have recognized, it was a miracle achieved by improvisation, audacity, and a set of calculations about armor vulnerability, an angle of attack that Charles Carpenter had worked out in his head before anyone else had thought to ask the question. The aftermath unfolded with the particular texture of military history, equal parts bureaucracy, recognition, and the permanent inscrutability of institutional decision-making. General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army, came to inspect the bazooka-armed Grasshopper personally. Patton was not, by reputation, a man who was easily impressed. He had commanded armies. He had driven campaigns across North Africa and Sicily, and now across France. He had seen innovation and improvisation in many forms. He looked at the L-4 with its improvised rocket tubes and is reported to have found it satisfactory. He encouraged Carpenter to continue flying. This was the kind of endorsement that settled questions. Carpenter was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He was promoted. The official citation credited him with destroying or disabling 6 German armored vehicles in the engagement of September 20th, and acknowledged the broader pattern of his combat operations in the days surrounding it. The language of military commendations is often formal to the point of bloodlessness, but the facts it recorded were not bloodless at all. They were the facts of a man who had gone looking for a fight with weapons that military doctrine said he should not have, in an aircraft that military common sense said he should not have weaponized, against targets that military physics said he should not have been able to defeat. The bazooka modification was never officially adopted as standard equipment for L-4 aircraft. This is the kind of institutional decision that invites the question of why, and the answer, as with many such decisions, involves a convergence of factors that are individually defensible and collectively frustrating. The modification worked in Carpenter's hands because Carpenter was Carpenter, because he had the experience, the judgment, the timing, and the specific combination of aggression and calculation that allowed him to exploit the tactical window the weapon opened. Standardizing it across all observation pilots carried risks that armchair analysis could enumerate, but that Carpenter had simply declined to acknowledge when the alternative was watching tanks roll toward his countrymen. There is also the possibility that the institutional discomfort ran deeper than logistics. Carpenter's achievement implicitly challenged a number of assumptions about what observation aircraft were for, what observation pilots should do, and where the line between reconnaissance and combat action properly belonged. Militaries are not primarily engines of innovation. They are engines of standardization, and standardization requires that the exception be managed. Bazooka Charlie was an exception that had been brilliantly managed in the field by the man himself, and that could not be easily replicated by regulation. When the war ended, Charles Carpenter returned to teaching. He went back to the classroom, back to the work of explaining to young people how history moved, what drove it, what human beings were capable of when conditions demanded something extraordinary from them. He had, of course, become an example in his own right, a man whose story illustrated precisely the principles he had spent his career trying to convey: the relationship between preparation and improvisation, the gap between doctrine and reality, the question of what happens when an individual confronts a system that says no and decides, with full knowledge of the consequences, to proceed anyway. The aircraft he flew, the concept he proved, the geometry of attack he pioneered, that a slow-moving platform could engage armored targets from above, striking through thin roof armor in a way that no ground-based weapon could replicate with the same combination of mobility and angle, did not disappear when the L-4s were retired and the war receded into the past. Military thinkers who studied the effectiveness of anti-armor aviation in the years after 1945 had to contend with the uncomfortable evidence that a former high school history teacher with improvised rocket tubes had solved a problem that remained relevant for decades. The question of how aircraft could most effectively kill tanks did not end with the Second World War. It continued through Korea, through Vietnam, through the Cold War standoffs in Central Europe, where planners imagined Soviet armor flooding through the Fulda Gap. When the United States Air Force eventually developed the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a ground attack aircraft designed specifically and unashamedly around the single purpose of destroying armored vehicles, The design philosophy it embodied had ancestors that stretched back through the doctrine of close air support to the practical experiments conducted over occupied France in the autumn of 1944. The A-10 was slow by modern standards, deliberately so, because the designers understood what Carpenter had understood. That engaging armor from the air required loiter time, required the ability to identify and track targets that moved and dispersed and hid, required the pilot to operate in an environment of ground fire and still make accurate attacks. The A-10 was armored where the L-4 was not, and it carried a 30mm rotary cannon that could reduce a tank to scrap from a gun run, and it carried precision munitions that Carpenter could not have imagined. But the underlying idea that the most effective tank killer from the air was not the fastest or the highest flying aircraft, but the one that could get close, stay low, and put ordnance precisely where the armor was weakest. That idea had a lineage that led back to a fabric-covered airplane over France, and a man who had decided that the answer no was not going to save anyone. Charles Carpenter's story is not a story about a superhero. It is a story about a man who understood a problem, found a solution that the system had not sanctioned, and pursued it anyway because the alternative, inaction in the face of a tractable problem, was something he found genuinely impossible. He had spent his professional life teaching that history turned on such moments. He had stood in front of classrooms and explained how decisions made under pressure, by individuals willing to act outside the boundaries of existing doctrine, had changed the course of events. He believed this, not abstractly, but in the concrete way that a man believes something when he has thought carefully about evidence over many years. And then the evidence arrived in person, in the form of a war, and he did what the evidence demanded. The 150 soldiers who walked through the gap he opened on September 20th, 1944, did not write extensively about it in the historical record. They were soldiers in the middle of a campaign, and the campaign continued after them, and there were other objectives and other dangers and the ordinary brutality of time and survival pressing forward. But they walked through that gap. They went home. Some of them had children who are alive today, carrying in their existence a debt to a man in a fabric airplane who came back 6 times when any reasonable accounting of risk said he should have turned away after the 2nd or the 3rd or the 4th. History does not remember all of them by name. It remembers Bazooka Charlie. There is something right about that. If this story stayed with you, if Bazooka Charlie's defiance, his ingenuity, or the lives he saved left a mark, please consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription tells us that stories like this one deserve to be told. And if you enjoyed this video, hitting the like button takes 2 seconds and means more than you might think. Here is a question worth sitting with. If you had been in Charles Carpenter's position, if your superiors had said no, the regulations had said no, and the situation on the ground demanded action, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments below. We read every one.